and he's going to kick us off, give us a little introduction, and let's go ahead and get started.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's so great to see so many people coming to be with us on what is a really important topic. We've got some great things to share with you today. We've got some good points. And right before I turn it over to Paula, I just want to be pretty crystal clear here about, from an SREB standpoint, we believe strongly that the idea of equity, the idea of diversity we can no longer wait on it to be the thing. We can no longer continue to talk about we should do this and we should have access to that. We actually have to make some deliberate decisions that we are going to eliminate issues of equity, that we are going to not allow students to wander invisibly through our schools anymore, that we are going to make conscious decisions to see them and to let them know that they can be part of a system that can help them find a way to be an effective part of our economy. And so the work that Rebecca has put together here in the context of our schools at work really provides some good insight as to what we're going to be, what we see from a little bit more of a macro level. And, you know, it's hard. I mean, a lot of people will say, oh, I am equitable with everything. But sometimes we have to actually pause and really take a good hard look and realize that we all have work to do, and that this is a constant ongoing decision that we have to make to ensure that each child has the opportunities that they deserve. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Paula and publicly say to Rebecca, thank you for your work, and I appreciate all the work that you put into this, and really looking forward to the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, great. And I am Paula Eggleston. I am the Divisional Director for Research and Accountability at SREB, and we want to welcome you today. Thank you for attending this webinar on educational equity. And we are going to have two speakers from SREB. The first is Rebecca Purser, and Rebecca is a research associate in the Research and Accountability program area. She has a master's degree in qualitative and quantitative research methods, and her master's degree is from Georgia Tech. At SREB, she specializes in statistical analyses, data visualization, and reporting. Our other speaker is Quentin Granville. He is a SREB instructional coach, and he has either a bachelor's or master's degrees in psychology, social work, and education from Clark University, Atlanta University, University of Georgia, and Mercer University. He's worked for Georgia's Department of Child and Family Services and as a teacher for Atlanta Public Schools. As Stephen has said, student equity is a critical topic that SREB is interested. We want to ensure that every student has a quality learning experience, and this is even more so with the advent of the COVID-19 pandemic. Judging by your responses on the registration form for this webinar, you are keenly interested in equity issues. On the online registration, we asked you about your greatest needs as far as virtual learning for the upcoming fall and what your concerns were. We had over 400 individuals that registered for this event, and many of the things that you said had to do with student equity as far as digital devices, as far as access, as far as quality instruction. These are serious issues. Rebecca and Quentin, during our webinar today, will explain our equity study results, focus on COVID inequities and experiences, and then provide recommendations and action plan. Because we want you to take what you've learned today and do something with it. We ask that you should hold your questions till the very end. We'll have an informal session afterwards. after the formal webinar is over. And if you have any technical issues, please privately email either Kirsten Sundell or myself, Paula Eggleston, and in the chat box, and we will help you. We'll have an SRB in front of our names. We want you to complete the evaluation form, and I now am going to introduce Rebecca Purser, and after she speaks, Quentin Granville will speak. So thank you.
All right, thank you for that introduction, Paula and Dr. Pruitt. We've got a lot to cover today, so let's go ahead and dive in and get started. So Quentin and I have been working collaboratively to put this webinar together for you all, and I think it's been a really fun process. We both serve, as you can probably hear from our backgrounds, pretty different roles within our organization. So I primarily work in our headquarters on some of the behind the scenes data and research, while Quentin spends a lot of his time out in schools doing face-to-face or now during COVID, virtual coaching. So as you'll see in today's presentation, my team worked on a study that we published earlier this spring, and this is sort of the next step of that study. So what we're doing today is we're really saying, what do we do with this information? How do we make it relatable and a useful resource for educators? So it's been really enriching to work together with someone like Quentin to combine some of our areas of expertise into a really synthesized end goal. So what you'll see on the screen here is a visual on the left, and that represents our mission at SREB. So as many of you know, what we do is we analyze and publish, we convene and engage, and we also support action. So our goal with this webinar today is to really hopefully check all three of those boxes. The visual that you see on the right is really what our mission for today's webinar is. And that is to present the research based on our data collection and analysis, but to make sure that we're not presenting research in isolation. We really want to contextualize the research with some concrete real world examples and some practical takeaways. We also really want to engage you all by giving your own examples and providing feedback so that you're not only learning from us and hearing what we have to say, but also from one another. So here's our game plan for today. I want to start out by talking about equity in a holistic sense, as well as equity specifically in education, and why that topic is particularly important right now. I'm then going to give an overview of our research and accountability team's recent study on equity in students' school and classroom experiences. So I'll really outline the who, the what, the why, and the how. And I'll also outline what our findings and main takeaways were from that study. I'm then going to hand it over to Quentin. We worked together to really tie the findings and takeaways from the study into some practical applications in the field. So he's going to walk you through all of the examples of how inequity manifests itself in schools that he's seen that he works in, both prior to COVID-19. And then lastly, we're going to cover some recommendations that we developed based on the data and research, as well as Quentin's practical expertise, and whether or not those recommendations are really fully feasible for your school or your situation where you're at right now. Our hope is to sort of get the gears turning on how to get started and really thinking through how you can level the playing field in your school. Again, mics are going to be muted due to just the volume of participants that we have today. We really want you all to use the chat box throughout to chime in, respond to our reflection question, everything. And we will try to have some time at the end for questions, probably about 10 minutes. If you want to stay on, you'll have the opportunity to ask us some questions. Again, whether that's via the chat box or the just if you want to unmute yourself, and we might have less participants then, so that should work fine. This will be recorded and sent to all participants and anyone who registered afterwards. Okay, so before we dive in, I always think it really helps to get to know who you are as our audience and what our participants sort of look like. So I'd like you to take a second to answer this poll question. It should pop up on your screen there, and you can just respond directly within the Zoom poll. So how confident do you feel in your ability to tackle issues of inequity in your environment, whether that's a school, a district office, a classroom, or even a workplace? So you should be able to respond using the Zoom poll that should have popped up on your screen. And I'll give everyone just a couple of about a minute there. You guys are fast responders. I like that. As a servant gal, that's my dream. All right. It looks like we've got a pretty even spread. Let me see. All right, give it a minute. So this is the spread we've got today. I would say that that is sort of what I expected, to be honest. I know that we have people from all different environments, and I think that most of us can agree that whether or not you feel not very confident at all or very confident, this type of topic is an ongoing learning process for everyone, really no matter where you're starting at from today. Okay. All right, so our topic of choice for today's webinar really stems not only from everything that's happening in our country's current climate, but also from our internal ongoing mission for education. So SREB's 5-year strategic plan is really grounded in a vision of equity in school and classroom environments, which our topic today pretty much directly addresses. So a line from that plan is, our goal is for each child and adult in the SREB region to have high quality educational opportunities that build on the rich diversity of the region and lead to productive, meaningful lives and robust economies. And an important piece of that line is the fact that we're talking about each child, which echoes a similar sentiment to the quote that you're seeing on the screen right now. So in education historically, as most of us probably know, there's really been a pattern of sort of the haves and the have-nots. This isn't a new problem or a new issue, which we're definitely going to talk about, the fact that this isn't necessarily new, but it certainly deserves our commitment and our attention. So recently I've participated in a handful of equity-related webinars, some podcasts, and had a lot of really great back and forth discussions with Quentin. And a line that I keep hearing that I feel like really sums up what we're talking about is the fact that inequity is not new. What we're right now during COVID-19 are some of the exacerbated effects of inequity. Again, due to the pandemic, due to the recent Black Lives Matter activism and a big swell in that. But as many of you know, none of this is necessarily new. So today we really wanted to make sure that we captured the full picture here. So a lot of us are focused on the right now, which is getting through COVID-19, and understandably so. But what happens after COVID-19? Are we back to square one? Are we back to this first blue bubble? And furthermore, what was happening in this first blue bubble, in the where we were? In a lot of cases, students who've experienced inequity are going to continue to experience one adverse situation after another. So in the future, that may not be in the form of a pandemic, but it's something that they're most likely going to face, at least in some capacity again. So the data represented in the study that I'm going to cover represents this first blue bubble, which is the where we were. The data that was collected is from 2018, which gives us a really good snapshot of sort of what things looked like prior to the pandemic, at least within the schools that we work in. Our natural inclination, I think, is to think about where we are right now, which is this green bubble. We're in the middle of a pandemic and we're right in the middle of a COVID-19 period, and some pretty unique challenges. But arguably, most importantly, I think we really want to be thinking about where we want to go. So what's the vision for change and how do we get there? Whether that path starts with some baby steps, some uncomfortable conversations, or even some bigger systemic changes. That's going to depend on where you're starting from. Okay, so what do we mean by equity? I'm a researcher at heart, which means that I know and appreciate the importance of really defining a problem before you try to dive in and solve it. So I wanted to make sure that we took the time to talk about exactly what we mean by equity, and particularly equity in education. So in education, a lot of times the term equity is confused or used interchangeably with the term equality, but they actually have pretty different meanings. So the World Health Organization defines equity as the absence of avoidable or remediable differences among groups of people, whether those groups are defined socially, economically, demographically, or geographically. We're talking about education specifically, and equity in education. Equity means offering individualized support to students that addresses possible barriers like poverty or limited transportation. This is the Waterford definition for equity in education. So equality really means treating students all the same way. Equality is a lot more generic and group focused. Equity is a lot more adaptable and individual focused. A lot of you might be familiar with the authors Budge and Parrott. They wrote the book Disrupting Poverty. And what they said, which I think is important, is that treating all students the same, while in theory that might sound just and fair, actually can be quite the opposite and can end up being pretty unjust and unfair. And I think that this is a good visual representation for that. So what you'll see in this graphic is basically that the same equal tool doesn't work for everyone. The support really has to be tailored in order to meet the needs of each individual in the graphic to make them successful. Let's see. Equity is also about increasing access to opportunity through equitable, not necessarily equal, distribution of resources like time, money, and people. So this next visual represents a city planning or sort of like a community resource visual for around equity, but I definitely think that it holds true in education. So increasing access to opportunity, as we know, is really fundamental to student success. And the mechanism to do that is by really determining what the resources are that not only all students, but that each student need in order to succeed, so that really both sides can be successful, even if one needs more resources or more support than the other. Okay, so I want to do a little check-in. I want to hear you all. As we saw when people came in from totally different states, we've got really diverse setting that everyone is coming from. So inequity can look a lot different in varied settings. And I think that one of the best parts about working at SREB is getting to see education through such different lenses. So what about in your setting? Think about the visuals that I just showed. Think about resource distribution and matching supports to needs. How might inequity in student, school, and classroom experiences be showing up in your school, your center, or your district? So take a couple minutes. It could be 10 words or less, a quick paraphrase, but what might that look like in your environment, whether during COVID or during normal face-to-face instruction? All right, I'm just looking at this. Yep, internet access. I know that technology is a big one during COVID-19. Help at home, yep. As you can see, there is definitely not a shortage of some of these issues. I think that everyone on here is pretty well aware of some of these things that might be showing up in your school or in your setting, which I think is a great start. The recognition of some of those is going to be really the first piece of that. Okay, I want to get started. Feel free to continue sharing your responses in the chat box, but I want to get started with this first piece, so the where we were piece of this. As many of you know, like I said, the issues of inequity around students' home life and accessibility during COVID are really a small part of a much bigger problem that, again, is not necessarily new due to COVID-19. They were just, in a lot of cases, further highlighted because of COVID. So what did some of those previously ingrained inequities look like? To get a picture of our assessment of the where we were aspect, I'm going to talk specifically about our research and accountabilities team study, our team study that we began back in 2018 using our biennial student survey results. So these school improvement surveys have been administered for over 30 years now. Some of you probably have participated in them at one point or another. And they were designed around our SREB 10 key practices for improvement to really capture student perceptions about their school and their classroom experiences. These surveys are used as a tool for schools and centers to identify some areas of strength and areas for growth. And in 2018, we had over 7,800 student responses across 103 high schools in 15 different states. And at a really high level overview, this study sought to examine two main things from the survey results. The first was patterns of variance in students' responses. And the second was factors that had the biggest impact on students' school and classroom experiences as represented by their overall survey responses. If you want to do a deep dive into this publication, feel free to do so. You can use the link on the screen, and it's also on our SREB website, and you can see all the nitty gritty if you're interested in some of the real details behind the research of this report. But the study was based on essentially a twofold design. So first, we used statistical analyses to look at whether we had more variation within survey respondent groups or between survey respondent groups. And what I mean by that is the grouping mechanism when schools take our survey is always at the school level. That's our unit of analysis. So we wanted to look at if variation within survey responses was greater within one school or between distinct schools. Next, we looked at a list of personal and academic variables that you see on the right in this blue box. And what we did is we matched those up to students' overall score on the student surveys. So a higher overall perception score means that a student is typically experiencing more positive experiences and best practices are occurring at that school. So basically, we wanted to see what impact these certain factors had on that overall score. So were certain students having a different experience than their peers? And were there any patterns to this difference in experience? So that twofold design gave us these three main research questions that we wanted to answer. Number one, again, is there greater within school or between school variation in students' school and classroom experiences? Number two, do school and classroom experiences of high-performing students who meet benchmarks on nationally standardized tests differ from those who do not meet readiness benchmarks? And number three, which student-level variables related to equity have the strongest explanatory power around students' school and classroom experiences? All right, so we organized our findings around those research questions. And our first finding is, as some of you might have guessed, responses to most survey items actually showed greater variation within a single school than between separate schools. And if you're familiar with any other research on school level effects on student performance and experience, it's not necessarily inconsistent with that research. A lot of that really asserts that if you take two students of the same ability level, it doesn't necessarily matter which school they attend. A high level of variance coming from responses really suggests that some other factors like outside of the school unit, like school leadership, teachers, classroom environment, home life, school culture, those are really the determinants of variation in students' experiences. However, I will say that it still was a noteworthy finding because of the wide range of schools that SREB serves. If you all have been to any of our conferences, you'll know that we have people, we work in schools in rural West Virginia, we work in schools in urban Birmingham, Alabama, for example. So think about that. There were bigger differences in student experiences within that one in West Virginia or within that one school in Birmingham than between those two schools in vastly different settings. I saw a question in the chat. How do you define school? Is that a district or a building? A building. That's how we define school for this. Okay, so for the next finding, or sorry, for that same finding, the way that we were able to get that is we looked at the variation within what we call an interclass correlation test. And for all of the indexes that you see here, this is a little bit nerdy, but basically what this tells you is that all of our ICC scores were close to 0. If it's closer to 0 than to 1, which these were all significantly closer to 0 than to 1, it means that there's more variation within the unit than between distinct units, so between schools. So for our second finding, we created a meeting benchmarks performance variable for students based on a set of criteria to see if these students had different experiences than their peers who did not meet benchmarks. We wanted to look specifically at this category because we know that a lot of times kids who are sort of considered like the best and brightest may have a totally different experience in terms of education than other students. So for example, I know at my high school, AP and IB students had their own guidance counselor, which was a really great resource for applying to colleges, getting scholarship information, letters of recommendation, and really a full range of career options. So that ratio of counselor to student was around 30-1, while for all other students who were not in AP or IB, their counselor to student ratio was closer to around 300-1. So that means that they really had to compete for that resource. To qualify for this category, students met nationally recognized college and career marks on either the ACT, SAT, or ACT Work Keys exam. And within this grouping alone, most students were both non-minority and had a higher predicted socioeconomic status. Predicted because we use a proxy variable for this. I also want to note here just quickly that this is by no means an all-encompassing measure of student academic ability, but just for the sake of the data that we had and the wide variety of participants, this was definitely the most standardized measure that we were able to use. So this is just outlining that data. As you can see here, a large majority, around 73% of students in the meeting benchmarks category were white. You can also see here the nice comparison of parental education of students meeting benchmarks versus those who did not meet benchmarks. So mother's level of education is what we used as a proxy variable for socioeconomic status. There's a lot of research that shows that's one of the highest predictors of socioeconomic status. And again, around 73% of the students meeting benchmarks reported that their mothers had some education after high school, in contrast to only about 50% for students that were not meeting benchmarks. Okay, so thinking about that group of students that I just outlined, our next finding looks at their experiences in comparison to their peers. So overall, what we found here was that the students meeting benchmarks had consistently more positive experiences in their school and classroom than their peers who were not meeting the same benchmarks. So while this distinction was definitely consistent, it was consistent across almost every single one of our survey questions, it was small enough to suggest that, you know, being what might be defined as a traditionally sort of high-performing student was definitely not the sole or even maybe the main determinant in a student's experiences. And just some examples of the types of questions where they had more positive experiences. So one for literacy is my teachers encouraged me to share my opinions about the text we read. Around counseling and guidance, I discussed with my counselor, teacher advisor, what training or education I would need after high school to achieve my career goal. Around school culture, teachers at the school have high academic expectations for all students. So students meeting benchmarks had consistently more positive answers on those kinds of questions than their peers who did not meet those benchmarks. So again, I mentioned that the difference between those two groups was consistent, but it was small. And so we wanted to look at some of those other student level factors that could be impacting that original high variance that we saw in survey responses within a school. So if you remember our list of variables slides back, what we looked at, basically we used a stepwise regression model, and we looked at the relationship between students' personal and academic variables and then their overall survey perception score, which represents their school and classroom experiences. So of the variables that we examined, the ones that were had the biggest expected increase in overall perception score were having enough credits to graduate at the end of their senior year, a high level of parental or guardian support and involvement in their education, and students having concrete or set post-high school education plans and high educational aspirations. So in essence, a student within these respondents who say was on track to graduate, who had very involved and informed parents, who had concrete plans for after high school, or who say aspires to go to grad school and become a doctor, was likely to report more positive school and classroom experiences. So what does this really all tell us? What does this all boil down to? So when we were going through the results of this study, Quentin and I were talking it through, and there's some things that are unsurprising. You know, there's also some things that are kind of discouraging. There definitely seem to be certain student factors that appear to have an impact on the type of educational experience a kid has. We did find, however, though, that some of these results were actually, in a strange way, kind of promising, because the biggest impact factors, the variables that had the biggest impact, were at least within some locus of control of the school. So they weren't, like, for example, fixed or semi-fixed, like race or disability. So it really gets the wheels turning and begs the question of how can schools work to provide some systems and structures that promote equitable learning experiences to overcome these challenging factors for students. And whenever we're looking at student data, I just want to be clear, I'm sure many of you can relate, we never want to be putting students in a box. It is really important, though, to look at all student factors to see how those different factors might be affecting their experiences and whether those experiences are equitable to the experiences of their peers. Remember that this was an aggregate level study. We had almost 8,000 students respond to this. So with that in mind, what might this kind of data look like at your school or your center or your district? Are there factors that likely would have had a bigger impact that didn't show up within aggregate level data? So based on that information, the data that was just presented, I know that's a lot. If you want to read the full report again, then feel free to. What data stood out to you most in this? What was sort of your biggest takeaway from the research portion? And you can just summarize in, let's say, like 10 words or less in the chat box. Yeah, within school, variance was much higher than between school. Parental involvement is key. These are all things that are going to segue us nicely into this next piece. So the where we are aspect of this, again, continue to enter your responses in the chat box, but we're going to go ahead and talk about where we are now in this COVID-19 era. Obviously, this has drastically impacted almost all parts of many people's lives, particularly education. And some of the challenges facing students that we've already discussed are still going to hold true here. And some will be an even bigger impact factor than before. So now more than ever, particularly with the finding that students' parental support and engagement has an effect on their school and classroom experiences, we have to consider students' home lives as they relate to their education. So let's talk about what's next. My hope is that I've laid some of the groundwork by providing some data evidence that's going to help us determine where we go from here. I think that that's a really important first step, because otherwise you might be sort of throwing money or effort at what you think is a problem without doing some of the pre-work to determine what really those pain points and areas needing attention are in your environment. I'm a data person, so I think that this may or may not come naturally to you, but think about what kind of data you have available to you. It doesn't have to be survey data, although I do think that incorporating student voice is really important. What you can use to try to flesh out differences of different students at your school and provide the supports that they need. So everyone should have access to things like accountability data, which can almost always be broken up by student subgroups. You could think about other things like school climate surveys or other mechanisms for community engagement, and really get creative. But think about what kinds of data you could look at to really help lay the groundwork. So after conducting this study, what I did was work with Quentin to connect what we found in the study to what he's seeing working in schools. I love data and I love research, but data can really only tell us so much. And it's really about taking the next step of using that data in a practical way and connecting the dots and ultimately leading to action. So I'm going to hand it over to Quentin.
Thank you, Rebecca. And as I look at the data, it just reminds me of the privilege that I had to be in the classroom. And it really helps me to better understand best practices like using data to drive next steps, and also including the voice of those who you're trying to empower. So like Rebecca just said, the idea of taking the data and coming up with a strategic, informed plan to take on something such as inequity, to where now equity not only exists in a school, but impacts students in a way where they feel valued and that their best interest is in mind is key. And on top of that, making sure to listen and apply the voice of students so that things can be customized and tailored to address their needs. So linking to real world scenarios or manifestations, developing ways to improve systems and practices is our next focus. As we begin to go into these things, I think it's important to understand that the data represents how students perceive their experiences within their school. And in addition to that, it's important to understand that we're talking about taking on a challenge that is not going to be as easy as flipping on a light switch and things are now resolved. As far as practical examples go, it takes me back to a personal experience and just reflecting on what school was like for me. I never really looked at school as a bad thing. I felt like there were teachers who gave me the best they could based off of the training and education they received. And there were a few challenges along the road. But what tends to stand out to me the most is a phrase that I heard more often than I feel like I should have during my young adulthood, when I was around 22, maybe 21 years old, where I would hear my friends say things like, can you imagine what our life would have been like if they would have really taught us like we were going somewhere, or if they cared about us the same way they cared about the smart kids? That was kind of something that I was aware of, but I didn't realize the lasting impact that those experiences in school would continue to have on those of us who attended that school, where some might have walked away or graduated and went on to look back on their experiences like they were all good. And there are others who feel like if teachers would have just pushed us a little more or did just a little more to try to support us with growing, then our outcomes in life could have been a little different. And what really stands out to me about that is the idea that there are some kids who continue to feel that way in 2020. If you work in a school, I'm pretty sure you may get kids to come back and visit and share their thoughts about when they were in school and how it continues to help. When I see kids now who I taught back in the day, I'm fortunate and I feel very blessed that they'll have things to say about what I helped them with when they were in the 7th or the 8th grade, but their high school experiences, a lot of times they don't see the same way. So when we think about how does it have a lasting effect, and where is the place that we should address to make sure that students leave high school feeling like they're prepared and the support and services they receive put them in a place to go on and succeed, versus now they've been thrown to the sharks? Well, if we look at what's taking place in the classroom as far as rigor, when it comes to literacy and math, and the difference that may exist in an AP or honors class versus a general ed or remedial course. If you've been anywhere around education, you've heard the idea that all students should be treated and taught as if they're honor students, as if they're the best thing in the class, as if they're the best thing in the school. As far as what's being reported from the numbers, not all kids feel that way. We shouldn't linger on that. We should think how to approach it. That comes next. As far as student tracking and what the trajectory of one's life look like based off of a score that they make in elementary school, middle school, and how that determines their educational experiences once they reach high school. That's something that tends to be a part of a situation where inequity is present. Lack of education and career guidance. Rebecca mentioned earlier about how at some schools, AP, honors, gifted kids have a guidance counselor. I can remember when I was in school, and even when I was a teacher, there were certain students who the counselors sought after whenever scholarship opportunities came up. And that often created a divide between those who felt like I can do it if you just give me a chance versus those who had a certain reputation and was always sought after. The disconnect between home and school life. Inequity not only gives students a negative outlook on what's taking place at their school, it can also have a negative impact on how parents view the services that the school is providing. In other words, some parents may feel like a school doesn't have their child's best interest in mind or in heart. And some of this could stem from when they were in school in the 80s, 90s, or perhaps early 2000s, and when they were students themselves, they probably felt the same hurt and agony that one can be going through as a student as they're isolated and pushed in on a certain track, or their expectations and the effort that the teacher gives to teach in a classroom doesn't look the same when compared to an honors or a gifted class. Now, I brought up a lot of things that are manifestations of inequity. This isn't to harbor on the negative. It's to get an idea of what problems exist so that as we move forward, we can get a good sense of how to address them. Where we were, where we are, and where we're trying to go. COVID-19 pulled the curtain on a lot of things. In my opinion, some of these things were already there. They were just amplified. Access to one-to-one devices with the charge to try to make sure that students have technology so that they can participate in virtual learning. I think we all learned that that's a real issue that needs to be addressed, not just during COVID-19, but when we go back to face-to-face learning, ensuring that students are exposed to what the world looks like as far as technology and the dependency on one technology skills to elevate as far as academic and career success. Parent, guardian, technical skills. When COVID-19 happened, a lot of parents had to become an employee for whatever role they serve in their jobs, a teacher, an instructional coach, a cafeteria worker. They had to take on multiple roles. As far as ensuring that parents have the skills to support students moving forward, one has to be mindful of providing tutorials, videos, and other types of services at the school that can even be a part of the PTA meetings, where parents are taught how to navigate through Google Classroom, where parents are taught how to be aware and participate on things such as Google Meets and Zoom. Amplified impact of neglect or hunger. I saw where we have some people who are from South Carolina, some people who are from Mississippi, and other places around the country. So the idea of amplified impact of neglect and hunger these things may not be new to you, because before COVID-19, there were times when students showed up hungry, and this had an impact on their experience at school. Having awareness of this and having a sense of how to approach it is very key. Parents as essential workers. Once again, before COVID-19, there were some parents working 2 and sometimes 3 jobs, and students had to take on the role of parent at home. COVID-19 revealed this because now parents are in harm's way as they go as essential workers. And not only does a child have to take care of certain parental responsibilities, they also have to make sure to take on the role of teacher or instructional coach as they help their other siblings or themselves. Sickness or death of loved ones, the trauma and the grief that can exist as students try to focus on working and growing academically, loss of family income. Once again, before COVID-19, hours were being cut in a lot of places around the United States. I'm thinking about some places where I visit. I know the downtown area shuts down at like 3 or 4 o'clock. And seeing some parents having to hustle and bustle to go from one job to another. And right now I'm talking about parents, but I'm also aware that there are some teachers who work multiple jobs to try to make ends meet. And as we talk about serving students, they feel underserved themselves. So that's something that has to be addressed also, as far as loss of family income and the role it plays in creating a sense of inequity that can exist within a school. So capturing the full picture and where we're trying to go. Once again, applying the data and student voice to be able to make some type of informed decision. So here are the recommendations. Focus on what the school can do as opposed to what families at home cannot do. Develop structured communication plans. Cultivate a culture of high expectations for all students, not just the highest performing students. Involve each family and the community through academic and career counseling and a teacher advisory system. So as far as recommendation 1, the idea of control what you can control and make sure you do your best to produce a positive outcome comes to mind for me. As far as inequity that exists within a school, fortunately, school leadership and teachers can do a lot to address that issue. It's a formula. If school leadership takes on understanding the problem for what it is and creating goals to address inequities that may be specific to their school. And once again, to go back to what Rebecca shared as far as the data. So you have multiple schools, but it's the internal experience of the students that stands out as far as how they perceive their educational experience. So what's happening at school A versus school B can be different. It's up to those respective schools to get a pulse on what inequity is at their school and approach it with that understanding. Once you develop that understanding, build goals to address it. And with those goals, there has to be a plan that's implemented to achieve them. That's where the commitment part comes in at. I'm pretty sure we can all agree that one's words is a lot different than actions when we talk about how committed you are to creating change. It's up to the school leadership to provide teachers with support. When taking on inequity, it's not a dream walk through paradise. There are going to be ups and downs that can pull teachers in emotionally and can pull teachers in as far as they're giving all they have, but don't see any change. Students may still perceive things as negative. Teachers need support in that area, and services to help them continue the process. Continuing to apply students' voice. This reminds me of how formative assessments or check for understandings are used within a school. Continuing to get a pulse on how students are feeling and their perception of how the school treats them throughout the school year. And that information can be blended with teachers as far as their behaviors. How do you believe when it comes to students and their ability to perform? What mindset do you have not only when you're teaching, but when you're planning instruction, when you're looking for resources to engage students in work? Having awareness of the issue as it relates to what could be inequity in the school, and making sure that your effort matches or exceeds the expectations that you have when it comes to all students performing at a certain level. Blending school leadership actions and teacher behaviors can lead to positive impacts as far as student efficacy, perceptions on school, and the motivation to learn and engagement in what's taking place in their classrooms. Recommendation 2, develop structured communication plans. Whereas the school leadership communicates with teachers, making sure that they receive training, making sure that teachers are aware of the expectations as it relates to addressing inequity in schools, and supporting teachers with implementation. We talked about resources and the role they play in student learning. Resources play a huge role in implementation and things developing into positive outcomes. School leadership communicates with teachers. Teachers communicate with parents by providing instructional support. For example, if the teacher is teaching a struggling student and there's a specific formula, a strategy that the student has to be able to master to perform, creating tutorial videos that can be shared with the parent, using your school social media page as a way to communicate with parents so they know things beyond just behavior reports and field trips. They have a good sense of how students are performing in the school and ways that they can support students at home. And students learning management systems, making sure to communicate with students through the learning management systems as far as opportunities for extracurricular activities, different things that students can do to hone or nourish skills that'll help them go from a certain level of learning, elevating to a higher level. And what I mean by that is if a student is reading on a certain grade level, exposing him or her to information through Google Classroom, through Canvas, that can help him or her grow. Recommendation 3, cultivate a culture of high expectations for all students, not just the high performer one. Increase students' exposure to quality instruction, expand students' engagement in critical thinking and response activities, apply information to customizing what high expectations should look like for students. What this comes down to, once again, for me is if you're going to have high expectations for any student, make sure that you put in high effort so that all students are learning and walking away feeling like they're growing for whatever growing means for them. Recommendation 4, involve each family and the community through academic and career counseling and a teacher advisor system. Skill-based and performance-based extracurricular activities that promote collaboration and inclusion. In other words, creating a platform where students who are in general education classes, gifted, honors, AP, can come together to network and learn from each other. A good example of that is robotics. But unfortunately, at some schools, there are prerequisites or certain rules that prevent those who are not in higher level courses from participating in things like that. opening doors to where students can come together, learn from each other, and once again, network and build a culture of achievement that can spread throughout the school is a way to take on that. Summing it all up, and this comes from our vice president and one of our directors at SRAB. All students, regardless of gender, race, or socioeconomic background, can master challenging academic courses at CTE curricula when they are taught in an environment that encourages and inspires them to succeed. Thinking towards the future. Here's a question that we would like for you all to reflect on and really consider. And we appreciate your participation as you all have put information in the chat box. Think about the data that was presented, the practical examples that were presented, and the recommendations. What is the first step or next step in addressing equity issues in your school or district? If you all don't mind, just take a few seconds to reflect on the current state of equity at your school and steps that you all probably have been taking. And if you're a school where this is something that you all are just beginning, what is the step that can be taken? We would like for you all to share these things in the chat box.
Thanks, Quentin. That was great. I'm loving the answers that are coming in too.
Mm-hmm.
Focus on what I can control and what I can do for others. That's a life lesson outside of just education, but yeah. Accurate data before making goals is always important.
The one that I'm seeing that stands out to me is the identifying the potential sources of inequity.
Mm-hmm.
Changing the mindsets of teachers, building solid, positive relationships, communication, and education about inequities, and get the student voice. Yeah. People often run away from the idea that education is one of the biggest examples of customer service. And if you aren't getting feedback from your customers, what are you using to guide your practices?
Definitely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Equity and equality are not the same. There's some really good visuals out there. I mean, you saw the ones that I put up there, but you know, even just posting some of those around the building, something like that, really continuing to sort of jog people's memory that those two terms are different and they mean different things in terms of how they're delivered in school.
Outstanding. Well, Rebecca, I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next slide, okay?
Okay, yeah. All right, so that brings us to a close today. Appreciate you all joining us. Great feedback and collaboration within the chat box. I think that's been one sort of good thing that's come out of COVID is I feel like every webinar that I'm on is even more enriching than the last. You really learn a lot from the other people who are also on the webinar as well from the people who are presenting. Our team is going to stay online for about another 10 minutes or so just to answer questions if you have any, or if you'd just like to talk to us about anything in particular. If you don't have time to stick around, I know we're right at 5 o'clock mark for at least us East Coasters, but if you have a question, then our contact information is listed here. Feel free to reference that, send us an email, anything that you'd like. Quentin, can you advance one more slide?
Yes.
We would love your feedback. The link that you see on the screen will take you to just a quick post-webinar survey. You can also use the QR code that's on the right here. And then I've just relinked the report for your reference. It's on the SREB website. There's also information about our surveys and everything. And hopefully if for some of, I know many of you have participated, I'm sure, in our surveys before, and this gives you an idea of sort of what we do with that data or how you could be thinking about that data after you get it back. So feel free to stay online to ask questions. Otherwise, we really appreciate you joining us today, and have a great rest of your week. We'll give a couple of minutes for people if they don't want to stay online to ask questions. And then if anyone does, feel free to either enter it in the chat box if you feel more comfortable, or you can maybe raise a hand if I'm technologically savvy enough to figure that out. But okay, I'm seeing, yeah, there we go. Kirsten has also entered the link to the survey in the chat if that's easier for you. But give us your feedback, it always helps us improve. So I think we can go ahead and start taking some questions if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question or type one in the chat box. Here we go. All right, we've got one in the chat.
Yeah, there's one in the chat about classroom inequities. I think it was from Myra, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so she says, is there a way to spot evidence of inequities in a classroom? What are the signs, and what are the signs that there is a potential problem?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I was taught during my first year in the classroom, the program that I participated in, we had this training regimen called Diversity, Community, and Achievement. And if you know what DCA is, you know what I'm talking about. The idea was at the end of each day, try to name all the students who you teach. Those who you forget are more than likely those who you're looking over in the classroom. As far as being in the classroom, we have a lot of trainings that focus on positioning teachers to take advantage of proximity. And we all know that you should be very cautious about breaking out of the force field that is the front of the class and behind the desk. If you find yourself missing a question from a specific student or specific groups of students, it could be a sign that inequities are taking place. And these aren't things that I read anywhere. These are experiences that I was burned by when kids would come back to me later after class or during a parent conference, and they would explain they felt like I didn't care about them. And that wasn't my intention, but because I wasn't aware of what my actions were communicating, the kid felt left out. So the most practical and classroom level examples were those.
Mm-hmm. One other thing would be, well, there's many, but another one would be to keep a chart in your classroom. This is something I did when I was a classroom teacher, of who you're calling on, because there's certain patterns that emerge with that as well. Kids that you're not calling on, there may be a problem. Want to go to another question? Gregory asks, I'm still confused about the variation when within being greater than across schools.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So this basically comes down to statistical analysis that happen once you get survey results in. So what you can do is pretty much look at, there's always going to be variation within survey responses, and actually having high variation usually means that you designed a pretty good survey. That being said, though, there's mechanisms to look at whether or not the variation is going to be really where that variation is coming from. So I used what's called an intra-class correlation test. And that tests whether within the grouping mechanism of the survey, whether the variation is happening between, so for example, if it was just on an individual level, then the variation would most likely be obviously greater between each distinct unit, because each person's answer would be different than someone else's. Since our grouping mechanism for these surveys is at the school level, we were able to look at whether or not between distinct schools or within schools there was higher variation. And what the ICC score tells us is that there was a lot higher variation actually within schools rather than between the two units. That's the high level overview of it. I'm happy to go into more sort of statistical explanations of that if you'd like it, Gregory. Just shoot me an email or something. But that's the basic breakdown of it. And it does sound kind of surprising at first. And I think, though, after doing a good bit of research, it's not necessarily something that's uncommon for the actual school unit to not be really what is determining differences in students' experiences or even in students' performance. So,
yeah, with what Rebecca shared, project-based learning in the schools that were surveyed, the kids reported in the higher level classes, they were participating in project-based instructions. Kids in the lower classes were not. The same with how math and literacy were taught. As far as use of small groups, student as facilitator, you'd see that more in the higher level classes than the lower level classes within that school.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And actually that was really our first layer of this study. We got those statistical results, and that's what really prompted us to look at, whoa, okay, there's a lot of variation happening within schools. Like, what are some of those factors then that are making one student or, you know, a group of students within a school have different experiences than their peers? Can we tease some of that out, and what does that look like? So, anyone else have a question for us?
Thank you.
Yeah, no
Can
problem.
I just ask?
Yeah.
This is Myra.
Hi, Myra. Go ahead.
Well, I was doing equity labs here in Missouri. I don't know how I even got invited to this, but I'm glad I did. And in the northeastern part of the state, we don't have a lot of racial differences, whether it's African American or Hispanic. We have a little more than we did, but we have schools that there's no differences there. And so to get them engaged in the idea of equity, I was putting out the idea that we have kids with gender differences. We have kids with disabilities. We have kids in poverty situations, you know, some of the stuff that you've been talking about today. And one of my concerns, I guess, is that because people don't even realize they have biases against certain students, they're not going to do anything to change that. And that's kind of what I was asking about, you know, how do you go into a classroom and see if a problem exists? Where do you start that process, and how do you go about getting it to change? And I know those are huge questions that you can't answer in a minute or so, but it's really been nagging at me for the last 6 months, because it's awfully easy to ignore certain kids in the classroom, as Quentin was talking about. You only see the ones that you like. How do we, how do we fix it? How do we go about? You can have all the data in the world. You can do all kinds of studies. I have yet to hear anything that says these are some of the steps you can take to make a difference. Does that make sense? Am I saying it well enough to make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense to me, because what you're touching on has a lot to do with a person's internal awareness, and also being aware of how what you think and feel influences how you see the young people you're responsible for teaching. So you mentioned that you only see the students who you like. I think you can add on to that. You only see the students who you consider as bad or struggling during certain times. So let's say, for example, if the principal asks, well, give me an idea of the number of students who you think are going to score proficient on your benchmark. In that moment of panic and negative energy, you think about, oh, well, he had his head down, and so on and so forth. And so your internal dynamics influence what you're talking about. And just to put myself underneath the microscope, you mentioned disabilities and socioeconomic status as things that play a role in inequities. Gender, for me, played a role, and I didn't know it until some of the little girls started making me aware of it. Also, it all depends on where you are, what side of town someone stays in, whether or not a kid comes from a 2-parent or 1-parent home. And these are some big issues, but I think the most simple thing that one can do if you're talking about being accountable for who you are and the role you play is to start by examining yourself first. And unfortunately, that's not anything that a lot of districts can just force a teacher to do, but that makes a huge difference.
I think real quickly, something else, it's like this is a school issue. It's a teacher issue, but it's a school issue too. And so the idea of taking this on is action research, where you look within your classroom, but everyone is doing it. And Quentin's right as far as whether gender, whether socioeconomic, basically calling on students, making sure that each student is addressed personally, which can be hard when you have 25 kids in a class and you're operating virtually. But there are things, I mean, everyone can investigate this. And one of our SERV staff mentioned in the chat box the idea of doing an audit. So this is both at the school level, and then it's also at the classroom level, but everyone's doing it. It's not just one isolated teacher or a teacher team. This is a whole school effort.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking also in principals having a tool, whatever that might be, a way to look at a classroom and spot issues. Like at one time they would talk to teachers about only looking on the right side of the classroom, never calling on anyone on the left side. And over the years, people started adjusting that and thinking about it, especially as student teachers, and training themselves away from it. I don't know that it's a passion, but it's rapidly becoming one. In our area, in my area, we've had kids come out when they were in high school. 3 of those kids committed suicide. Other kids have left the school and gone to private schools in other states. I think that's just incredibly sad. We have kids that are in extreme poverty that see no way out because they're not getting the kind of help they need. We've had counselors that only worked with the kids that had money to go to school, wouldn't talk to the kids that didn't, and I can't say what all of the issues are now, but I know we have problems. And it's like this burning issue to help. And I know that as a young teacher, I had a gifted, he's turned out to be very gifted. And one of the first days of school, he was questioning the way I was handling the noise in our classroom. And 3 weeks later, I realized he was losing some recess time every day. It wasn't so much that he was doing something wrong, is that I was looking for him to do something wrong. And that was in first grade. I had to pull myself up and make myself aware that that's not fair to him. He's just being himself. But that's hard to do.
Yes, in the recommendations, one of the things that was mentioned is teacher support. And you touched on what came to my mind and heart when I think about teacher support, because when you start to take on things like inequity, you start to realize the role you play in it. And that can be heavy for a lot of people. For me, I started seeing a lot of my bias, a lot of my ignorance when it came to religion, when it came to, how I saw education versus how my students saw education. And I mean, there were so many things that I had to learn to let go, because it always goes back to, as far as the classroom, the teacher is the most important instructional resource. So if you don't have that person 100% taken care of from the inside out, because you can have all the iPads and smart boards, but if that person hasn't been supported with dealing with what comes up when you judge, because you will judge some of these kids. It's just a part of what's going to happen. You're going to give all you got, and some kids are going to fail, and you're going to start to question their intellect, how their effort, whether or not they're lazy or if they're trying. And you have to meet those types of thoughts head on and have mechanisms to get you past them so you can continue to support students at a certain level. And it was brought up that, I have a master's in social work. I have a background in psychology. It's those things that help me to weather the storm of a lot of self-doubt and a lot of things that came up that pointed to me, letting me know I wasn't as, open-minded as I thought.
Yeah, there's some good things in the chat box, and you all have Quentin and Rebecca's email addresses. I'm thinking that we'll probably want to close down the session, make sure that you've completed the evaluation, and we want to thank Rebecca and Quentin for the session today.
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Appreciate your feedback and your interaction in the chat box. Yeah, thanks for joining us. Hopefully we'll maybe have more opportunities to do more of these. Look for Quentin and I are probably going to do this at summer conference next year.
Yes, definitely.
And thanks a lot, Ms. Collins. You took me back to when I was in the classroom. I missed them. Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thanks. And you guys have a good evening.
Okay. Take care, everyone.